Hey, Kurt, thank you for joining me today. I'd love it for just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Kurt Sanger. I am a recently retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Marine Corps. Had a pretty standard career as a Marine attorney or judge advocate. For the first part of my career, I was a defense counsel and then a prosecutor for special and general courts martial. Then I did what's called staff judge advocating, or being the general counsel for a number of different types of units, some more operational than others. Then was an instructor at Marine Corps University. But then that led me to my last 8 years of my career, which was spent with Cyber Command, the first 3 with the Marine component under Cyber Command as their senior attorney, and then up to Cyber Command for my last 5 years, where I had several different roles, finishing as their deputy staff judge advocate or deputy general counsel.
So what kind of things do you see, or what did that entail as an attorney in cyberspace in the Marine Corps? Like, that's a very unique experience that is interesting.
So unlike many of the other legal disciplines I was in, unfortunately, there was no set of books behind me or websites that I could go to where there were centuries worth of legal precedent, or even as an officer in the military, there weren't thousands of years with millions of warriors, successes and failures to look back on. We were basically making things up as we were learning what we were doing. So for those years at Cyber Command, we were making law as we were setting up the frameworks for the operations we were doing. And for every new operation or new administration that came in, the operations that had significant impact, we were incorporating new lessons learned, new standard operating procedures, new ways of doing business, and developing legal precedents out of the way that we learn these lessons.
Wow, that's ever changing. This is new landscape and all of cyber. But to your point, a lot of legal is finding those documents from 100 years ago, 200 years ago. This legal precedents that doesn't exactly exist in cyber warfare. And how do I respond to these things? And what are those boundaries? Wow, that's interesting. So all of that kind of leads into, from an attorney and cyber and from what are some of those big concerns that you guys had and issues that y'all were fighting in cyberspace?
So for the military, there's a regime that applies to most armed conflicts and the types of operations that militaries traditionally do, the law of armed conflict.
Sure.
And that is basically meant to protect civilians' lives and limbs and prevent the significant destruction of property. That's usually not at stake in cyberspace operations. Of course, great damage can be done through cyberspace operations, but for the most part, nations have not been using it that way. So we had to find a new way to apply the law of armed conflict, or see if the law of armed conflict applied. And when it didn't, find what the principles were, the values that we were protecting through those law of armed conflict rules, and seeing how do we apply them in cyberspace to achieve the same kind of results with our operations that we would in other types of operations. When life and limb and property destruction is not at stake, there's still other values that we need to protect in terms of, especially for the United States, ensuring that cyberspace is still available to everyone for their use. Things other than what is normally protected by the law of armed conflict. Those were the types of things that we needed to look to see how are we going to protect them when the law of armed conflict does not apply.
Yeah, with cyber, it's interesting. As you look at Colonial Pipeline or a lot of these incidents, ransomware, they're not necessarily trying to damage equipment, but by making it inaccessible. Like if you think about a power plant or a train, if the operator can't control that equipment that's moving, life can happen. Like something can hurt. People can get hurt, damaging of infrastructure, or long-term effects. It's not as simple as shooting a bullet and doing destruction at that endpoint right then. It can be a domino effect of smaller issues that roll into bigger ones down the road because of a ransomware attack. And we've seen before we started recording, we were talking about the weather here in Texas and how a little bit of water starts dropping, limbs on power lines, which causes power outages, which causes I can't pump gas, and all of those things roll into each other. So one little ransomware attack, even though it might not be a normal, armed conflict, it's still a way that it can impact us and our safety as a culture and as a country. So I could see how that's an interesting place to be.
Yeah, and it's great that you framed it as a domino effect, because legally there are different types of standards and regimes that determine what your responsibility for those dominoes are. There's a point at which it cuts off. Say if you are the owner of or you're responsible for a hazardous activity like nuclear waste disposal or explosives in construction. Strict liability rules might apply to you. So basically any of those dominoes that fall, you are going to be held responsible for those. Whereas for your average everyday citizen that's not an expert and not doing conducting a dangerous activity, they're probably only going to be held responsible for those things that are a proximate cause of what they do or what is foreseeable for what they do. And so the number of dominoes that average person might be responsible for is much different than it would be for the expert or the hazardous activity conductor. We don't know in cyberspace yet. There hasn't been enough public examples, perhaps, or public discussion about what responsibility a nation might have or any kind of perpetrator might have for a cyberspace operation. Particularly, you can take a look at Colonial. You can probably foresee through an operation like that a organization might not be able to deliver fuel under those circumstances, but are you going to be responsible for the other types of harms that might come out of that, like increased train travel to make up for the cars that can't get on the road? If there's a train accident because of those extra trains on the tracks, would you be held responsible for that as well? Right. That's a more debatable question.
Yeah, and as we see all of these things with Colonial Pipeline and all these things you mentioned, like there's not a lot of precedents and examples of these attacks in these spaces. How much of that is because we don't know? How much of that is because Colonial or any company X, they had an incident and either they didn't know it was a cyber incident, they didn't think it was that big of a deal or whatever, and they're not sharing that information that could help, whether with the government agencies or other entities that may potentially be having the same problem or things to look for.
So there's so many things that contribute to the difficulty of developing law in this space. The first, like you identify, is there's underreporting. People may not even see what's going on. If they do see what's going on in their systems, they may not report it. It's not like physical activity where, to take it from the armed conflict comparison, when a missile strike occurs, there are any number of commentators who know that it happens and they can comment on it publicly almost immediately. Right. Whereas when something happens in cyberspace, it may never be discovered at all. Or if it is, like say something like Stuxnet, it's discovered years later, and there's speculation based on what is discovered. But then there's all this part of most cyberspace operations of significance that people never see, one, because it's inside the system, but two, because the decisions behind it and the legal reviews, the policy reviews, the operational debates on what techniques to use, what targets to go after, all those are happening behind closed doors, only among people who have access to classified information. So even among allies, or even within the United States, certain federal departments and agencies might not see what others are doing. They may be aware of the activity, but they may not be aware of all the decision-making that goes into those activities. And then you scale that out to allies, to adversaries, to anybody else who has a system. You're not seeing everything that goes into a cyberspace operation the way you can either see it or speculate about it when it happens in the physical world.
Yeah, working at a power utility, it's deemed critical infrastructure. So when I was wearing that hat, I had to go through and get security clearance so that I could go to, classified briefings that around things that were impacting potentially us. But when you're not in that role, the normal manufacturer or the mom and pop shop, they're not having access to that data. Some of that could be, potentially really big for them to be able to know what to look for, what to block for, things that they should focus on. But that information isn't easily and readily just shared amongst, like you said, even internally within the United States, unless you're in those top tier critical infrastructure, deemed critical infrastructure, and then you've got a person that you can, get the classified briefings and go through all of that stuff. There's a lot to that. So talk a little bit about how can we better that? How can we improve that to share that information without, releasing things that don't need to be released? But that information could be critical to maintaining our infrastructure overall from all of those dominoes we talked about earlier.
When you think about it, there's seatbelts in my car because other people had accidents, and the information that come out of those thousands, millions of accidents over the years, they contribute to the safety of every vehicle that's built right now.
Right.
There are sprinklers in the ceilings of almost every hotel, certainly everyone I've ever been in the United States. And that's because insurers or government entities insisted on those safety measures being there. That information, the accidents that happened before, the lessons learned from those accidents, they contribute to the safety measures that exist now. You don't have access to the information. Well, first of all, there haven't, of course, been the decades or centuries worth of history in cyberspace.
Right.
But on top of that, the history that does exist, it's not accessible or visible to everyone. And so the lessons learned are not being drawn in the same way they have in other fields. And so the industry, the cybersecurity industry writ large, is not getting the benefit of knowing what went wrong and how to prevent it in the same way that it is in other fields.
Yeah, and some of that's going to be, and I know we've talked about this a little bit briefly, but some of that's because maybe the endpoints don't know. I had an incident. If I'm in a power plant and my unit trips, my operators are trained to get that thing back up and online, make sure that there's no mechanical or safety issue, that I can get it back up and running. But I'm going to get it back up and running. Those folks are not looking for a cyber incident. Like what caused? They're looking for mechanical things. They're looking for changes, but they're not looking at it necessarily from the perspective of, hey, there's a cyber, a bad actor. And a bad actor doesn't always mean China. It can be, Bob in accounting accidentally got on the system and did something he shouldn't have, or whatever, right? So we're not always looking at that. And then secondly, how much of that is because they're fearful of reporting that information and getting public and getting, a bad press release, and or have some kind of fine or the government coming down with a stern fist, and when they do know about it, how much are they just trying to fix it and move on?
So coming from the part of the military, my early career, where there wasn't cyberspace operations yet, we just had our communicators, and they were responsible for keeping our internet up, our radios up, all kinds of communication.
Right.
You only noticed them when the comms were down, because they were doing their jobs.
Sure.
And comms were up. That was situation normal. When the comms went down, you were calling your, what we call the J6, G6, S6, your 6 section, your communicators, right, and saying, hey, what's going wrong? So they were kind of trained that keeping the comms up is the most important thing.
Right.
Everything else is secondary. Now that you introduce a very dangerous threat in others being able to use our communication systems to steal information, to listen in, to take our computing power and take it away from us or use it for their own purposes, it's a much different set of priorities that a lot of folks that, my age and older weren't used to. They were only used to the comms are up and everybody's happy.
Right. Introducing
all these other things make it a much more complex playing field that you've got to integrate all these other considerations with. And that's the military, right? Sure. You think about, the military mindset of defending a space. At least we've got that in-house. But you think about every other organization that doesn't have to think about that, that has always been trained solely on, at least among your information technology personnel, the comms have to be up.
Right.
And everything else is either never going to be noticed, or I'm going to have to self-report it, which maybe I won't, or just any number of unseen things that your leadership won't catch, or even you might not catch, that nobody's ever going to complain about. The chances of discovering all that in a way that an entire organization can learn from it are just so far reduced compared to anything else that might happen that might injure an organization. So we've set up a very difficult regime that requires honest self-reporting, which means that you can't lash out at those who have done something wrong potentially, because you want to encourage their honesty. And you've got to be able to take a deep breath, acknowledge when you maybe have not reached optimum performance, so that the organization can improve. And I think that's the kind of thing that ought to be rewarded rather than punished. But I think the inclination is still to punish that kind of mistake.
Yeah, and availability is always the key focus around, in operational technology spaces. And if you look at the CIA triad, it's always availability and safety. Make sure it's safe and running. Like, that's, you look at a power plant, you look at a manufacturing facility, like, they care that they're running. They're not as much cared about, data integrity and all those other things. They just don't look at it as much. It's not that they don't care. It's just not lower on the priority list. So what are some ways that we can prioritize or incentivize folks to do this sharing, right? So I know that a lot of folks are looking at cyber insurance and kind of transferring some of that risk, and that helps them incentivize, because it can help them reduce their risk, and it saves them in money and costs, and a lot of that risk going to those insurers can help them and incentivize them, right?
Yeah, and there are a number of insurers who are really, I mean, it is true of any insurance contract, but it can be especially true here, that when you are insuring somebody's cybersecurity and their systems behind it, you are co-owning the risk. And luckily, insurers have caught on to this, and they are bringing expertise and tools of their own to those they are insuring. So say it's a small or medium-sized business that can't afford its own, or can't afford an adequate IT protection regime, the insurer can recognize that and say, okay, now that we are co-owners of this risk with our policyholder, we can take our expert tools and apply them to their system and hopefully improve across the board. And if you get enough small and medium-sized businesses doing that together, you scale up the effect of the cybersecurity that the insurers are bringing to those organizations. It helps everybody.
Sure.
So that is one of the great ways I think that the cybersecurity community is improving by say non-traditional collaborations.
Yeah, and the other side of that is so that's the carrot, and the stick side of that sometimes is the regulation. In critical infrastructure with power utilities, we see it with NERC-CIP, but TSA is coming out with them. There's a lot of regulations that are focused around enhancing the overall baseline cybersecurity posture for all of these entities. But with regulation comes there's struggles with that as well. So talk a little bit about the regulation side and where you see that and benefit, pros, cons, all that kind of stuff.
Well, we need regulation, but I'm also skeptical of it, because every regulation has a cost, whether it's just time alone. You're taking work hours away from some other activity of an organization. That has a cost. You've also potentially got to invest in tools that are very costly to protect your system. So I'm concerned about regulation, but on the other hand, regulation is meant to protect against the harms that might escape just the organization that has the faults and could hit a broader section of society.
Sure.
So there's got to be a balance, and there's got to be fully informed decisions about, all right, if we impose these rules on especially smaller organizations, what's it going to do to potentially damage those organizations in terms of the missions they are meant to carry out their main business reasons for doing business. You're going to be taking away from those focuses when you've got them focusing on something like cybersecurity. My other concern about regulation is that there is no organization right now, to include some of the big information technology companies, that has enough cybersecurity expertise. It's more easily found in the private sector, perhaps,
Right.
because of the awards that can be given. But in government organizations, I'd say every organization is under-resourced in terms of the expertise they need and what they actually have. So I'm concerned about regulation development in terms of, is the expertise there to develop appropriate and fully informed regulations? And I'm also concerned about enforcement on the other end,
Right.
whether the experts at an organization, there's going to be enough of them out there that they can monitor the entire field that they're meant to oversee, but also whether they're going to be able to recognize when an organization is at fault versus when something happened that couldn't have been prevented. Someone pointed this out. I don't want to take credit for it, but I also don't remember who said it, other than it was said during a WeDram meeting of cybersecurity experts. And one of them said, hey, when there's a fire in your kitchen, you're supposed to have a fire extinguisher to put that fire out. But when there's a fire on the roof of your house, you're expected to call the fire department. The government's supposed to step in and help you out. What I'm concerned is that when something happens in cyberspace, one of those fires happens, it's going to be difficult to distinguish between the kitchen fire and the roof fire, and that organizations may be blamed for things that were beyond their control because there's not enough expertise to recognize when something was really one's fault and when something was just facing too powerful an adversary, or the system was just designed in a way that it virtually invited certain types of malicious activity.
Yeah, and cyberspace is such a unique weapon. It's unique in that I'm not, my experience is that I'm not trying to stop all things from happening. Like, there's no way that I can make it so impenetrable. No way's maybe an exaggeration, but it would be really expensive the more hard I try to make it to get in. Like, I know that it's going to be passed. Like, I can put firewalls, I can do all of these technologies, but when I have the employee that walks it in on the USB stick and plugs it directly in the system, all of that security and all of that money and all that policy that I did, they bypassed it. So it's impossible to make it unbreakable. It's like, I put a lock on my door. I don't put a lock on my door to keep bad guys out. I put a lock on my door to keep my neighbor out, right? A bad guy, anybody that wants into this, if given enough physical time and physical access, they're going to get in. Like, so you do security in depth. Like, I have multiple things. So knowing that in cyber, and especially in OT, where in IT, I've said this before, it was a little controversial, I guess, but IT seems to have some security built in, and we've been doing it long enough that you naturally have Active Directory and secure remote access, and you're limiting, you have DMZs. And OT, it's like IT was 10, 15 years ago, where we're connecting these things to these corporate networks, but we don't have the understanding, the experience and expertise, like you were just talking with the regulators. We also don't have that at the power plant, right? Or at the manufacturing facility. Like, a lot of these small and medium-sized businesses, they don't have an OT department. They don't have a cybersecurity focused team that's looking at all of these things for those types of, whether it be when they're architecting it, or when an issue or incident happens, they don't know to look for those things. They're not trained in those things. And when they're forced to do regulation, sometimes they're just checking the box. They're doing the best they can. They're not trying to not do good. They're not trying to avoid, but they're doing what they can and what they have to make sure they're compliant and maintain their ability to do their work. So I agree with you on the regulation. I think it's needed, but I am fearful of, forcing regulation without, and it always being with a stick. How, going back to the cyber insurance and other ways, like, how can we do regulation and entice people to do this? Like, give them value to do this, instead of always being with the hammer and the stick to, punish them when they fail. I find with my kids, excuse me, I find with my kids, they're usually more responsive if there's a goal that they're excited about, than when I'm threatening them. Like, yeah, they'll clean their room because I'm standing over and yelling at them. But when I'm saying, hey, if you clean your room, you get a ice cream, or I'll buy you a new Xbox game or whatever. Like, they're like going real fast and doing it really good, and they want to do everything they can to get it done because they're excited about the outcome. I don't see that as in the cyberspace, and especially with regulation, it always seems to be the stick, and it doesn't seem to be super fruitful.
Yeah, there'd have to be some inventive policy decision making if we're going to find those types of incentives. And your house sounds a lot like my house. So what would be the equivalent of the ice cream for the private sector? I'd say, it could be tax breaks. I mean, on the insurance end, I think the promise is, you reach the standard of cybersecurity and you'll lower your premium. I guess one of the things you can say is, if your organization reaches this level of cybersecurity and it is certified by whatever regulatory board or
Right.
overseer there is, that if there is an incident, we will protect you from certain types of critical activities. I don't know if it would be fair to say a private party couldn't sue you, but I think certainly saying the regulators won't take action against you because you believed and we believed through our certification that you had reached this level of protection that should receive special status. So there are ways out there to incentivize it that go beyond punishment. And yeah, we absolutely need to be looking for those, because this is a difficult enough area as it is for the non-expert, which, even though you may be running an operationally complex organization, but that doesn't mean you understand cybersecurity the same way you understand your energy delivery company, whether it's oil, electricity, nuclear, or otherwise. I wouldn't just assume that every critical infrastructure owner internally has its own cybersecurity expertise in the way that it has other types of expertise for other similarly complex endeavors. It doesn't mean that they're similar to cybersecurity.
Yeah. So talking about that with policy, and that policy is coming from regulators, from folks in DC and elsewhere. How do those folks get their knowledge? Because I'm pretty sure my senator and my congressman are not cybersecurity experts. They have to make decisions on a lot of varied topics that obviously they're not experts in, and I know they have staff that they're getting to try to find that. But really tying the private sector from cybersecurity professionals, from industry, getting that knowledge up and up that chain, and understanding the risks that they're having, the problems that they're having from a it's not always a technology problem. It's a financial problem. I can't find enough people to fill the roles. People, process, and technology. Technology is just one of those things. Policy is another one. But when I have plants all over the country, it's hard for me to find people to fill those roles to do the job. These are all things that go into the bigger picture of a cyber program. It's not just finding the right technology. It's how do I build this out so that it's resilient and it can push up. So how do we tie that back in with the government, with the regulators, with private industry, with consulting, like all of those things kind of tying together for the betterment of our country?
Well, the first thing I'm thinking of is that some of the larger information technology companies, to include Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, forgive me if I've gotten one of those wrong, but
yeah, that's the FANG, right?
Yeah, they've just released 40,000 experts back
Right.
into the cybersecurity community that can be redistributed to other tasks.
Yeah.
I know NSA is trying to appeal to them, the National Security Agency, that of course, like every other government organization, I mean, NSA has a ton of cybersecurity expertise, but it's not enough, just like it is for every other federal department and agency too. They need more.
Yeah.
So they're trying to appeal to them to come work with their organization. But there's a lot of other federal departments and agencies that should be doing likewise. And there are a lot of private sector organizations that should be doing the same, because now, I mean, this is a significant number of experts who are out there who can go serve other organizations that need their help more than the FANG do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my first thought, is that, you know, it's available. It's just you've got to go out and get it, and sometimes you got to pay more for it. But if it prevents your organization from facing an existential threat, which, you know, most people have most of their personal lives and their professional lives, and most organizations have their operations so intertwined or enmeshed with their systems at this point, that everyone faces, or every organization at least, faces an existential threat, and every individual faces grave threat to their finances, reputations,
Yeah.
etc., if they don't have the expertise necessary to protect those systems. So you can't just think of your system as something separate that supports your organization. It is a vital tool that needs to get as much attention as any other activity that your organization conducts or that you as an individual care about.
Yeah, and that's the good thing, I guess, is we're seeing more and more of that those stories and mainstream media on the news outlets around things that are happening. You know, 10 years ago, you know, it was, most people had never heard of incidents in OT. Hey, I've ran this plant for 40 years. I've never had any incident like this. Like, why am I worried about this? They didn't think it impacted them. It was not me. That's the IT guys. That doesn't impact me. We're different. Don't worry about it. So it's always seemed to be this struggle on the OT side specifically, and obviously IT as well. But from my perspective, I guess I have a lot of experience in it, and seeing that risk, or really tying it to a business risk, not just a, you know, China bad actors. And that's the thing that you see in content from a lot of these technology solution providers. Hey, you know, the sky is falling, North Korea is going to get us, you know, all of the bad actors, which those are not wrong, but most people are not worried about those things. But really it is more tying it to a business risk. Hey, if again, going back to my example, if Bob from accounting brings down my manufacturing, it doesn't matter if it happened from China, or it was a bad guy, or it was just somebody that made a mistake. The FAA's system that went down, and all the airlines were canceled because, you know, a contractor deleted a file. Like, that's an incident. It was a cyber incident. It wasn't a bad actor attacking. It wasn't North Korea or China, but it still was a cyber incident that somebody made a change and impacted something that brought an entire system down. It goes back to Colonial Pipeline and everything else. So how does all of this tie back to, you know, coming from a legal perspective, how do we tie this to a business risk, and whether that's tying it to the chief risk officer, and really getting these organizations to understand this risk and classifying it as that, which may help them do funding, which may help them take it to the board and justify why I'm spending X amount of dollars on a cyber program, on a cyber technology, on cyber resources that are in the space available now, and why it's important to my bottom line as a business owner.
Well, there's a legal mechanism to do it, and they did it with accounting after some of the accounting scandals of the last 20 years, where someone needs to essentially take both civil and criminal responsibility via their signature for the accuracy of their accounting reports. You could do something similar for cybersecurity. My hope would be that, because it's so complex and because a number of organizations probably don't understand cybersecurity or have the personnel to understand cybersecurity the way they should for their accounting books, that it would be more about the post-mortem, the reporting accurately and honestly, and, you know, to the best of their ability, acknowledging that their abilities may be limited for some types of organizations, that at least we get that level of post-event fidelity that we can learn from and rely on. But there are other things, you know, for the more sophisticated organizations that absolutely must have cybersecurity to ensure that daily life in the United States is able to continue, such as financial organizations or some of the larger energy companies, that the cybersecurity folks in those organizations are held to a higher standard of accountability. Doesn't necessarily have to be criminal as it would be for accounting, but at least in this field, something could be put at stake such that you are incentivized and motivated and rewarded properly, because you've got to reward those people who take those risks, that the parts are put together in a way that cybersecurity is elevated as a business issue and as a personal issue, and that not only the cybersecurity folks at an organization understand that risk, but everyone in the organization understands what's at risk as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I came from Ernst & Young, which is, one of the big four consulting, accounting firms. Obviously I'm not an accountant. I did cyber work there, but even as a cyber consultant, I was still held to those SEC regulations around all the Enron and all of those things that came from being an auditor on that side. So lots of training around accounting. And again, I'm not an accountant. I took accounting classes in college, but I'm not an accountant. But I still had to take all of those things. And we took cyber awareness training. And of course, as a cyber professional within there, I was definitely taking training, but it didn't seem to be the same impact as the auditing side and the accounting side. So maybe there's some of that to what you were just saying around, really just making sure people understand, yes, it's your risk to make sure you don't, give a bad guy your password and give them access to your computer and all those kind of things, but really with the understanding of why. And on the financial side, we understood because of Enron and examples like that, why it's so crucial that I don't buy stock in a company and advise them and all of those things that they're trying to limit by lying and holding that information, and because it impacts people. The same thing is true on cyber. Like me saying, oh yeah, everything's good, I've patched my systems, nothing to see here, or my system went down but it wasn't a cyber incident. Maybe I don't know that there's a cyber incident, or maybe I didn't assume there was a cyber incident or whatever, but we need to think about it the same way that we did on those accounting sides, and really understanding that it's critical, not just for me, but for the bigger picture of everyone else, that we're really looking at it with a fine-tooth comb and understanding and signing off with liability and responsibility that this is important.
Yeah, well, that's one thing we did in the Department of Defense. We tried to prioritize the issue as a commander's issue, and rather than a J6, G6, S6 communicators issue. And the Secretary of Defense at the time, I believe it was Secretary Gates, I think it was 20, that must have been beyond that. I think it was 2018, put out a policy that basically said that this is a commander's issue. And really, you only have to get to one person in a Department of Defense organization, the commander, because the commander can make his or her priorities the priorities of everybody in the organization.
Right.
And if that commander took the issue seriously, I mean, certainly it was our raison d'etre at Cyber Command, so it was very easy to elevate the issues at that organization. But at your infantry organization, making something like cybersecurity a priority is, much more difficult task, because they've got very serious missions to worry about. But those missions depend on the security of their systems also. So I think it was smart to make commanders, understand that they could potentially be relieved of their command for incidents that happen in cyberspace. And in the organizations on the private side that I think are doing cybersecurity right, they've made a culture of compliance and a culture of understanding what damage they can do to their system. Doesn't have to be intentional. Could be negligent, unknowing, completely innocent, that they can do damage to their systems through one wrong move. And that could affect, not just that individual and not just the organization, but, the college funds of every child, of everybody who has a parent in that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And it everything is connected. And I said that domino example before, little things that may not seem big, but they turn big really quickly. You know, you're dealing in critical infrastructure, you're dealing in people's paychecks, and all those things tie together. And you know, it's very easy for a small thing to become a big thing, and things that you may not think are all that important. And that was one of the things they really got into our head, and all of that training and all that compliance stuff that we had to do was, hey, you may not think it's a big deal, but you should still report it. Like you don't have, I don't have any financial impact on this business, but this doesn't seem right. I should report it. Like it's really around, you should report it. There's no impact if you report, you're not going to get in trouble, but there is impact if you don't report it. So like if you do something, something happens and you don't raise your hand, there's a consequence to that. If I reported and it wasn't a big deal, or it wasn't anything, there's no consequence to that. Or even if it was, right? It really showed that it's important to report, no matter how small, how insignificant you think it may be. It is your responsibility and duty to do that. So all of this, right? We always like to end these things on what's something positive, and maybe what's something that concerns you, in whatever order you think. In the next 5 to 10 years in the cyberspace, what are a couple of things? One thing that you're excited and looking forward to and hopeful for, and another that maybe concerns and you want to really focus on.
Something to look forward to is that the people that, now that I've retired from the military, someone has taken my place, and then someone will take that person's place. And the people that take places from now on, they will be more cyber savvy than certainly I was, and I think every generation that comes after, they'll have grown up with these tools and these capabilities and understand them in a way that we couldn't possibly do. I mean, everything that I did in cyberspace, and most of my peers I think would say the same, is that we had to compare it to something else. We had to use analogy to help understand. And a lot of people reach back to the beginning of air operations in World War I to help understand the beginnings of cyberspace operations, which is helpful in some regards, but it also hurt in some regards. As more come into this, and I got to lecture a few times at the U.S. Naval Academy. There were some of their midshipmen were majoring in cybersecurity and information technology, that they'll be equipped to handle these things in new ways and think about them, with a greater background at age 20 than I've now got decades later.
Sure. And
they won't have to use analogy. They can just think about their history with it. And I think that's going to be a good thing for cyberspace generally, and for the military in particular, for cyberspace operations. What I worry about is, I guess it's as much social as it is, more traditional threats. But, what motivated me for my Department of Defense career was, working for the United States, and, the values that we swore our oaths to support in the Constitution. That was very motivating. As I leave the military and now I'm in the private sector, I think, what is the motivating thing here? And for me now, it's my children, and they represent the future. And I think this tool, cyberspace and the internet, it has the capacity to bring the world together or tear it apart.
Right.
And what I'm hoping for is that it can be secured in a way that you can use it to conduct commerce in a way that you can feel confident your money's going to end up in the right place, and it's going to go to the right people, and you will receive the products that you ordered. And that might lead to, the greater faith in these tools will lead to a greater connections between, the commercial connections, the social connections, even political connections, hopefully improve, so that there's a greater understanding of the different types of people in the world and the different ways of life. My concern is that the tools can also be used to divide us. They can be used to interfere with commerce, to steal the money, to make those ties a little bit less reliable, just as they can do that socially and politically as well. Right. So really, in the next 5 to 10 years, my hope is that we will see that the cybersecurity tools can be used in a way to make the system more reliable. the greater system more reliable. And that's what I'm working for right now, as I think all of us are in this community.
Absolutely. Man, I really appreciate your time today. Is there anything you want listeners to know, or ways to get a hold of you, or any call to action for the audience?
So if you needed to get a hold of me, you can find me on LinkedIn, I think is the easiest way to do it. There may be some other Kurt's with the K, Kurt Sanger, on the LinkedIn, but I think I'm the only one with the Marine background. So just look for that and you'll be able to find me online. But the call to action is to please, especially for some of the larger organizations, but for anybody who's in critical infrastructure, who has information that might be of interest to our adversaries. Say you've got interesting intellectual property or an interesting cyber capability, that you take a look at the National Security Agency's Cyber Collaboration Center or Cyber Command's Under Advisement Program. They basically share information with the private sector, and it is a bi-directional discussion that I'm hoping that both organizations get scaled up with more resources. But for right now, they have seen, I think on both sides, the private sector has seen, and those government organizations have seen a proof of concept in the success of information sharing coming out of some of the incidents that occurred over the past few years, as well as the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. There was some significant information sharing between the intelligence community and the private sector that helped protect systems. And my hope is that the private sector will ask for more of that, and that might motivate Congress and the executive branch organizations to put more resources against sharing information with the private sector, because the private sector shares the front line with the government for the defense of the nation in cyberspace in a way that it never has in any other domain. So sharing that information, the best information collectors, of course, in the government sharing that information with the private sector is critical to a greater United States cybersecurity.
Outstanding. Yeah, we'll make sure to include the links to both your LinkedIn as well as that program in the show notes here.
That'd be great.
Thank you for your time, sir. I really appreciate it.
Aaron, thanks so much. Great discussion.
Yes, sir.